I'm joining you from Australia, and I think it's customary for us to be acknowledging that we live in here on a stolen land, and the sovereignty for Australia was never ceded. I can share the details to get in touch with me in the chat after. So as Sally said, I am the co-founder of the Forcibly Displaced People Network. We were founded last year as a first registered in Australia LGBTIQ refugee-led organization. And there was a few other things like the Queer Displacement Conference that took place in 2019 that we co-organized before that. I'm now the outgoing chair of FDPN, and so in exactly 10 days, I'm no longer going to be a chair. What I wanted to reflect today is on that silence that gets to be written in policy on the international space. And I think looking at the New York Declaration and the Global Compact on Migration and Global Compact on Refugees, we see how that omission of particular groups really plays a huge role into how we get to see these groups. I got a chance back in 2018 to be a part of the gender audit team that was attending negotiations during the Global Compact on Refugees, and get to see sort of firsthand how probably while the kind of aspiration and the will is still there at the beginning, but then once we have, they have to do the compromises, all of that sort of vanished. If we look at the New York Declaration, its sort of overarching ambition was that, the boost to the solidarity at the international level, the commitment to human rights, to protections, support, and obviously it gave us the two compacts, the one on refugees and one on migration. And New York Declaration positioned sort of that it was done for refugees and for migrants. However, when you start looking at the text and you look at the engagement, the question really, is it for refugees and for migrants, or is it for some refugees and some migrants? And I guess, spoiler alert, it is for some. So when we look across all three documents, both the New York Declaration, who is missing is obviously LGBTIQ plus people in general. There's no mention. For example, the declaration went on to prohibit discrimination, but went down the path of sort of more standard categories. And what I even find interesting in all these documents that we don't even have the language of gender. We talk about sex, right? Which is kind of a debate on its own. How do we see that gender diversity across the board? And of course, again, New York Declaration showed that sort of compromise with the states that, we've got states that completely do not recognize the LGBTIQ plus rights, and so hence that never makes it to the document. The Global Compact on Migration is pretty much the same thing. Again, there's no mentions of LGBTIQ plus people as a group, which is one of the sort of big missed opportunities, but also some other opportunities, for example, where it could have included these groups as a list of vulnerable groups for example, early release from detentions, or under the affirming family rights, or in general recognizing that more compounding and more intersecting discrimination experiences. And again, that did not happen. But I want to focus a bit more on GCR because being part of that team sort of gave me a bit more of the insights. What I found really interesting when you actually look at the text is that there's not just no mention of LGBTIQ plus, but there is actual active silencing process. And it's not that we just don't have nothing and that sort of space is empty, it's kind of unoccupied, but rather that silence is really productive in creating sort of new meanings. And for me, it sort of sits on those three levels. One is that there is completely no mention. We have LGBTIQ plus sort of assumed or subsumed under age, gender, and diversity, and that stems from the UNHCR policy on age, gender, and diversity. And you sort of need to think, well, if everywhere in the compact you've got AGD mentioned, hence LGBTIQ plus people are mentioned. The UNHCR age, gender, and diversity policy in itself is quite an interesting thing because LGBTIQ plus are mentioned under the category of gender, which potentially from point of view of queer theory or gender studies could have been useful way, but again they still talk sort of about that sex segregation. You've got men, you've got women, and then you've got this sort of other group there. Then in the compact, you've got this big segregation in terms of there are dominant or sort of groups of refugees, like everybody else, sort of a homogeneous group. But then you've got those with specific needs. And I think quite often, once we're talking about specific needs, there is this tendency to sort of almost blame people, right? So we would say, you know, you are LGBTIQ plus, hence you experience, you know, like you are the high risk of violence or you experience homelessness or whatnot, without necessarily actually flipping the conversation to systemic issues, that the actual reason you experience those things is because, you know, our states are inherently homophobic and transphobic. And so that's sort of also, but again, I'll show you in a second that even that category of specific needs groups doesn't include LGBTIQ plus. And then you've got this idea of othering, right? So this is the paragraph from, the excerpt from page 3, which talks about discrimination, and it says sort of all types of, you know, basis for discrimination. Again, note how it says sex, no gender, and then says all other status, right? And so it's sort of like, if you know, you know, right? Like if you would sort of think that LGBTIQ plus people deserve to be in that other category, they're there. But if not, they're not. And so again, we're othering this group. We're not necessarily even, we don't think it's actually worth mentioning that that group exists. And so this is the example of the specific needs. And what I found quite interesting in here, that this particular paragraph is very complete, right? It finishes in a full stop. So this paragraph does not even give us sort of another, you know, groups of people or, you know, etc. or so on. It actually has specific list of who are considered to be specific needs groups. And of course, you know, again, we can be saying, well, we can interpret that, you know, LGBTIQ plus people can be, you know, the survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, or they can be survivors of torture or whatever. But again, you know, when we say we can interpret those things, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are the same level of interpretation. And surely, you know, that kind of interpretation is not going to result in really robust policies, you know, on kind of across the whole journey of displacement, from addressing both the drivers to sort of going more into the settlement spaces. And so for me, that like is a very clear example of the silencing, of erasure of these groups. And there were a lot of experiences when I was actually at the Global Refugee Forum of really active sort of acts of erasure, including, you know, threats to boycott the forum if you have LGBTIQ plus in you know, written in paper, and so on and so forth. So it's not just, you know, the oversight on paper, it's the actual tactic not to have this group included. So looking overall at the actual global compact, I think there were quite a few, you know, obviously missed opportunities, but in terms of the LGBTIQ plus specifically, I think one of the main missing points is, of course, to recognize the group as a standalone social group. You know, we've got quite a bit of different international guidance sort of overarching on a high level existing that this specific group does have specific protection needs, and yet it's not recognized. I also think that the whole idea of also, because looking at, for example, interventions of states during the event, the whole idea of simply reducing LGBTIQ plus sexual and gender-based violence is also problematic, because I think there is a bit of more happening. And for example, in countries like Australia, you do get to hear the discourse that people who come from countries where there is persecution enshrined in law, you know, definitely recognized as refugees, but there is a whole range of other countries where there are way more different ways of persecution and discrimination, and especially perpetrator impunity, that people simply cannot live their lives to the fullest potential. And yet, you know, if we're only reducing them to survivors of SGBV, we're sort of missing out on kind of a whole other complexity of experiences. I find it quite problematic and missing point that instead of actually operationalizing the intersectional approaches and looking at the refugee populations through that real diversity, there is that segregation by age and then diversity. And I think that sort of created that if you've got a category, for example, women and girls, they're just women and girls, and there's like nothing else that they can sort of have as that additional experience. And so, you know, it sort of almost blows the minds of policymakers when you try to say, well, you know, there are LGBTIQ plus people who are also women. I think it really missed sending that strong message in terms of human rights and inclusion, because once we go down the path that, we say, well, the global compact is for all refugees, however, terms and conditions apply. This is where, we clearly sent the message that LGBTIQ plus people were not on a sort of equal footing. And one of the really, I guess, important missed opportunities for me is that it really lacked in that coordination between LGBTIQ plus organizations and humanitarian sector. Looking at the negotiations for the Global Compact, there was no major international LGBTIQ plus organization in the room. The LGBTIQ plus sort of people were mentioned time from time. States like or Iceland, but there was no sort of systemic approach. And once there was time for negotiations, and once other states would be pressing sort of for moving particular parts, of course LGBTIQ plus or other issues like, for example, sexual reproductive health and rights, they will be the first one to drop off the agenda. And it's really disappointing that I guess the LGBTIQ plus sector did not pick that up. And in one of the conversations that I had, one of the reasons that were told to me is that because Refugee Convention was not a treaty body under which the states are reporting, however, having this sort of one almost in a lifetime probably opportunity to do so, I think it was quite an oversight. One of the things I also wanted to quickly reflect is on the Global Refugee Forum. I looked up this morning the most recent statistics, and it showed me that up until today, there have been just slightly more than 1,500 pledges made by all various sectors and organizations that pledged to do sort of their bit for the refugee crisis. And I was really curious how many LGBTIQ plus specific pledges were there, because back in 2019, we made the pledge to deliver the training. And so can people guess, maybe like super quickly in the chat in terms of percentage, how many LGBTIQ related pledges do you think are there out of the whole 1,500? I'll just like, oh, sorry, I just did a spoiler alert. But really, so this is the number of the pledges. Out of 1,500, there's only 12 pledges that talk about LGBTIQ plus. So this is less than 1%. And when you actually go down the path of looking what those pledges are, was really interesting, because if you search by the term LGBTIQ, only 3 pledges come up. So 2 were refugee-led orgs, one of which is ours, which are kind of like almost inclined not to count. And out of those 3 pledges, one is LGBTIQ plus specific, and one what are called listing pledges. They are pledges where they would say, for example, we will ensure meaningful participation of women and girls, LGBTIQ plus, people with disabilities, like whatever. They just like recount the whole sort of like different diversity categories and groups without necessarily having that meaningful engagement with one. If you do put the acronym LGBT, so the total number is 12, and that's the final number. And out of those, there's a few pledges that have states like Canada and Iceland talking about specific LGBTIQ plus resettlements. But again, out of the 12, there's only 5 LGBTIQ plus specific and 7 just sort of very generic that, didn't bother to mention this group, which is sort of a step in a positive direction. But again, thinking, I guess, of the context, how we currently live in the world where you've got almost sort of 1/3 of the world where there is some form of persecution in the legislation. And then you would have so many more countries where it's just simply impossible to be who you are. And only having 12 pledges specific to this group, I think it's quite disappointing. I wanted to finish up by just sort of flagging that this is the document, Canberra Statement on the Access to Safety Justice for LGBTIQ plus forcibly displaced people, that was developed back in 2019, when we did the Queer Displacements Conference. And this is the document that was written by LGBTIQ plus refugees and then widely consulted. And we designed it to be a guide for action and for solidarity. So it does have recommendations that various stakeholders can be doing sort of in their own fields, but I guess it meant to be that space where you could talk about those high-level issues that are really persistent in so many contexts and in so many countries, but also know what those solutions are and have those solutions to be led actually by people with a lived experience, in a sense that, it was the LGBTQ refugee-led drafting process. So I can send the link in the chat if people keen to explore. But otherwise, thanks so much for having me today.